Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, a podcast about the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. And this is part 3 of our mini-series on Nottingham, fantastic city. And in this episode, we will be focusing on the urban landscape of Nottingham, its buildings, its architecture, its layout. We'll be going right back to its origins, looking at its industrial growth and the buildings that are a legacy of that growth. If you've not heard them already, take a listen to parts 1 and 2. Part 1 has a general introduction and overview of Nottingham, and we talk a lot about the politics, the castle, the Luddites, crime and justice. It's well worth listening to. Part 2 covers industry and culture. All those episodes are available at yeoldeguide.com and on all podcast directories. So this is part 3, and we'll be talking about urban landscape. The layers of growth of the city leave an essential legacy in its layout today, which we can see. Let's start with an overview of these historical layers of growth.
Yeah, but let's do a chronological overview of the development of the city. Now, the origins of Nottingham as a major urban settlement are in the area around today's Lace Market, where the Saxon town existed. There are a couple of indirect physical remnants of the Saxon town. First, the original Trent Bridge was constructed by Edward the Elder in 920. This was replaced in the Middle Ages and again in the 1870s. 2 flood arches of the medieval bridge that replaced the Saxon one do remain there in situ if you want to see that. Second, this era, the Saxon era, is when the first city defences were constructed. They were built in the 10th century, again by King Edward the Elder, and augmented later. But the last visible remnant, a 12th century gatehouse where Chapel Bar is now, was demolished, unfortunately, in the 18th century. There are still some foundations under the ground, including in houses around Clumber Street, and the line of the wall was marked in a subway outside the Theatre Royal, which I think has now been bricked up, but still remains there underground. Next, after the Saxons, the Norman conquest is where Nottingham really started to develop into its kind of city centre layout of today, because it had really 2 separate parts of it, the English and the French towns. After the Norman conquest, the Normans founded a new borough around the castle they constructed, which effectively formed the second half of the twin town. They became the English borough and the French borough. The English borough, the old Saxon area, was around St Mary's Church in the Lace Market area today, while the newer French borough grew around the foot of the castle, and St Peter's Church sits basically in the border area in between. And this meant there were kind of 2 separate political areas coexisting for centuries, each with its own market, one on the border of the English borough and one on the current market square. Though the 2 markets may have come simply to specialise in different products more than being there to serve distinct communities. There was a wall right across the middle of the market square, which it's been theorised may have marked the boundary of these boroughs, though it's by no means known for certain that that's the case.
And you'd absolutely have no idea, if you didn't know this history, that the origins of those 2 separate places. Although I understand that on the market square, the newly redeveloped market square, well, it's not new now, is it? A couple of decades ago.
Feels new to me.
A couple of decades ago, the market square was redeveloped, and there was a line on there to commemorate these 2 separate town centres, if you like. But really, it was the industrialisation that we spoke about in the industry section that led to the expansion of the city.
Yeah, that's right. And the Industrial Revolution is really the era it began to shape Nottingham as it is today. And we can draw a real contrast between the pre- and post-industrial cities. Pre-industrial Nottingham was a very different place from what the city became. Daniel Defoe devoted a huge chunk of his travel writing to the city, describing it as one of the most pleasant and beautiful towns in England, while Celia Fiennes, around 1700, called it the neatest town I have ever seen. However, this all changed very quickly. The historian Eric Wood describes how in his words, elegant, aristocratic, spacious town became the blackest spot of the Industrial Revolution after 1750. Nottingham came to have, in his estimation, the worst slums in Britain and the worst, aside from Bombay, in the whole of the British Empire by 1840. You have to imagine here in your mind the very worst picture you have of dirty, deprived Victorian slum cities. And Dickensian England, that is Nottingham. An 1811 description of Nottingham wrote of a frightful town, narrow streets, and being oppressive, smoky, and riotous.
So why was it so bad?
Well, one of the key reasons is that Nottingham was just hugely overcrowded. In 1835, there were 53,000 people living in an area that had previously housed only 10,000, many working in the textile industries. People were sharing houses and whole families would live in one room. And it was overcrowded for the simple reason that Nottingham wasn't big enough. By the middle of the 16th century, the city area was only about 1,100 metres east to west by 750 metres north to south. The city sat surrounded by common land, like this big surrounding green belt, which you couldn't build on easily, along with land held by wealthy local families. If you want to get an idea of where this was, as we mentioned earlier, the Forest Recreation Ground is one remaining fragment of this surrounding common land. While a surrounding green belt may sound lovely, the city was really crying out for housing and room on which to build it. But this common land was owned by about 3,000 different people with all sorts of ancient rights, so it was impossible to get the right to build on it. There were big housing booms in the 1780s and 1820s, but nowhere near enough to hold the huge number of migrants coming to the town, as the population grew from 11,000 in 1750 to 29,000 in 1800 and 50,000 in 1830. The wealthy moved out from the centre, and if you couldn't afford one of the cottages in the surrounding fields, the only other options were to go to some of the further suburbs like Lentham. While there were still some houses carved out of the rock, the days of just turning up with a spade and digging your own cave were long gone.
Can you tell us a bit about the type of housing in Nottingham? What was the housing like in this period?
Yeah, there's an 1844 parliamentary report into this, and it shows plans of court housing, as it's called in Nottingham. And you can really see how enclosed and cut off these houses were. They were built with houses backing onto each other, with minimal space or privacy even between buildings. Even when there was new housing built, there was little planning control for the cramped, rat-infested, gardenless back-to-back houses which sprang up to try and hold these people, while many small natural havens in the city like pasture land or even trees were just done away with for industrial expansion. No one wanted to pay for improvements like drainage or proposed street widening schemes.
And we spoke about this kind of development in the Liverpool episode as well, the really constrained and overcrowded court housing. What impact did these conditions have on the people living in Nottingham?
Well, all this overcrowding, it led to cholera outbreaks, other health issues, and massively lowered life expectancies. One source puts the average life expectancy at only 22 in the mid-19th century, which was 7 years lower than the national average. Education standards were poor. Only about a quarter of the population could read and write. Children had to labour. Even the tiniest ones of 3 or 4 years old might have to help with lace making, while children as young as 6 might work 14-hour shifts in the coal pits, carrying bricks in the kilns, or as apprentices in the hideously dangerous factories. Now, without wishing to make too much light of this, my daughter's 6. She would not do well working a 14-hour shift, I have to say, if I tried to put her in one of them.
Grief. Dread to think.
No, she wouldn't
Horrible.
do well. But they had to them, and the city's inhabitants were hugely vulnerable to market fluctuations. And by 1830, half the people in the city were getting poor relief, were getting effectively welfare benefits to survive.
No, it's terrible. How did this get sorted in the end?
Well, really just through enclosure of the common land, i.e. kind of passing it off and almost privatising it. This would have allowed easier allocation of construction rights and allowed expansion into the surrounding common land. Initially, though, there was huge local opposition to doing this. One pro-enclosure candidate in the 1787 election had his effigy burned and his supporters dragged around the streets in dung carts. However, once the surrounding common land was finally enclosed in 1845, following municipal reform a few years earlier, which took control away from the clique of families that had been running the city, expansion could commence, which also meant, as Eric Wood points out, that you could take the opportunity to plan and to regulate the new suburbs, with the population able to finally spread and ease the overcrowding from about 1845. Now, all this regulation, it didn't just allow for construction, it also stated that 130 acres had to be set aside for recreation. And I do think that Nottingham feels like it does have these patches of greenery among all the reclaimed industrial areas surrounding the core. It also sets some housing standards. The transformation from the old slums was hardly instant. As late as 1863, George Bradshaw called the city excessively crowded, and some slum dwellings continued well into the 20th century. A 1925 description of Nottingham said it was like hell, getting beastlier and beastlier, while a 1967 report said 50% of the city's children in St Anne's, in the St Anne's area of the city, were living in poverty. So while Nottingham, I think, is a very pleasant place today, it was a long road to get there.
Let's talk a bit more about this expansion, because it's that expansion that leads to the patterns of development that you see today.
Yeah, let's do it, because ever since that common land opened up, Nottingham has been expanding, absorbing surrounding villages with boundary extensions at the end of the 1800s that almost doubled the population and took in Bulwell, Basford, Lenton, Radford and Sneinton, multiplying Nottingham's area by over 5. Further expansions took place in the 1930s, 1950s and 1970s, and nominally distinct towns like Beeston, I'd say, are basically suburbs of Nottingham now. And as part of this expansion, new roads known as boulevards there were built. Gregory, Radford, Lenton and Castle boulevards being among the main ones, but there are others. Now, these boulevards were wide roads built mainly in the 1880s at a time when such things weren't very common in England, these brand new big wide roads linking the city centre with the newly expanded city as it absorbed the surrounding boroughs.
That is a fairly unique feature of the inner suburbs of Nottingham, the presence of these clearly planned, long, straight, tree-lined boulevards. And then those later expansions that you've described are also big parts of the city's urban fabric as well. Some areas were completely redeveloped, to the south of the city in particular, but also really large council estates, council-built estates on the edges of the cities, these different waves of expansion. Do you think it was all done well? Was it all done well, this expansion?
Was it all done well? I don't think the consensus is that it was perfect. There's a 1970s account which describes Clifton as a graveyard with lights because it was so lacking in entertainment, which is a familiar complaint today about new build housing estates where there's potentially nothing to do nearby.
And Clifton was one of the biggest council estates in the country, and it's a lobe of urban development quite set apart from the rest of the city. It's got a tram line now, but I can understand how it might have been seen as somewhat isolated. But this got the city the housing it needed.
Yeah, there's no doubt. The authorities, they got on with things. They started building this housing the city needed. Towards the end of the 19th century, there's one source that records about 2,500 new buildings were being constructed each year in Nottingham. And lots of council houses were built later as well, after World War I into the 1950s. But while the problem of quantity was being resolved, the problem of quality with the residual housing stock, the older housing, still remained. Even after thousands of new homes were built, about a fifth of the city's homes in the late 1970s still didn't have baths. However, public improvements did continue. There was more 1970s work in the city centre that gave us pedestrianised streets, plus the Victoria Shopping Centre in 1972 and Broadmarsh Centre in 1974. And I must admit, I never would have guessed that Victoria Centre was the older one, as that always felt more like the modern, perhaps the more recently refurbished one when we were there. But the Victoria Centre was built as part of a social housing project on the site of the old Victoria Railway Station, whose flats are the tallest buildings in Nottingham.
And they really are quite prominent. They're really tall, and it's a big shopping centre. I think the Broadmarsh is an example of, it's one of those Arndale centres where it's left a sort of wall of concrete in the middle of the city. So I'd say it's been quite damaging to the city's urban fabric. I think it's pretty much all been demolished as of now. I think there's a big open space in the centre that's being turned into a park. But these centres have had a huge impact on the city centre because they occupy a lot of space.
And I'd have to say on that, I mean, this is one rare occasion we can be eyewitnesses to history. When I go back to Nottingham now, it feels so different walking through that Broadmarsh Centre area. It's just an unrecognisable bit. You used to walk through the shopping centre, walk out the other side, past the buses to get up to the train station, but it's not like that at all anymore. It's almost disorienting.
Yes, it is. I mean, those big shopping centres, the wall of concrete shopping centres, they were built all around the country, Arndale
Yeah.
centres, and I think they were what we wanted at the time because it led to rebuilding city centres. But
Yeah.
they've had quite a damaging impact. I think of places like Luton has got the same effect as Braunmarsh, where it's like a wall across the town.
Mm.
Now, I noticed usually when we talk about urban expansion, urban layout, we dwell quite a lot on Stuart buildings or Georgian buildings, and we didn't say so much in this case. Are there so many Georgian buildings in Nottingham?
No, we've kind of skipped over it, but mainly because Nottingham is really a modern city from the 18th century onwards. While there was much Stuart and Georgian rebuilding as gentry came to live in the city, not many 17th century buildings survive. Those that do are mainly public buildings like schools and almshouses. And I think this fact of it being a more modern city is kind of epitomised in the lace market area, which perhaps we can talk a bit more about now. The lace market was, as we said earlier, the original pre-Norman, the original Saxon centre of Nottingham, and has, I think, been transformed by renewal of industrial buildings in the last few decades. It was the centre of the English town around the weekday cross, the location of Nottingham's original marketplace, along with public whippings and bull baitings that used to take place there. Now, this area was full of Georgian houses and the centre of the town until the 19th century. However, people escaped the suburbs following city expansion and trade moved in, where there had been residential buildings with warehouses added, many of which were subsequently demolished. There is a bit of a nod to the past here. Several of the streets around there have Viking names. They're called Gate, the Viking word for street, which reflects Nottingham's Viking heritage. However, this era did give us city improvements like the water supply and clear streets, plus the racecourse, so it did leave its mark in some ways.
Yeah, and that area now, so it got these sort of 5 or 6 story warehouse buildings associated as they appear associated with lace manufacturing. So I suppose lace manufacturing buildings, and they've now left this quite pleasant part of the town where you've got decent density and interesting buildings like the Adams building. But like you say, there's not much left of Georgian Nottingham. There's one street high pavement that's got some Georgian housing on and churches, which feels a bit more historic, but generally it does feel industrial. Well, shall we now turn to some specific buildings and architecture you can see in Nottingham, and perhaps its most unique architectural form is that of caves. Tell us a bit about the caves.
Yes, Nottingham Caves. Nottingham has been called the City of Caves, and even today, when many of them have gone, you can still see why. You can see entrances to some of these caves all over the city, and they exist in Nottingham because the city is set on soft sandstone going down up to 20 feet, which can be dug into easily, and all of these caves are man-made.
What were they used for, these caves?
Well, a lot of them were used as homes. In fact, people were living in these caves for centuries, with even Saxon accounts noting the cave dwellings. And this carried on for, as I said, centuries. A 17th century visitor said, why, the people live not in houses, but are earthed in holes. It was also said that if someone was poor, all he had to do was go to Nottingham with a spade, dig himself a home, and have his animals grazing above him, and he'd be happy as Larry. Sneinton, in particular, to the east of the city, had some really good examples of cave dwellings, more sophisticated ones, with staircases, even windows, plus brick frontages, almost a bit like the old Tricks Jerusalem pub these days. The caves near the castle were used for all sorts: cockfighting, drinking, toilets, and growing mushrooms, while some were used from the 1650s as security safes. Some were even used as air raid shelters in the Second World War.
Can you see any caves today?
You can. Many of them were destroyed or filled in by Victorians, including most of those developed ones in Sneinton. I think probably because they were associated with the squalor of the city at this time, felt not proper for human habitation, but also as part of road and railway introductions. However, there are still plenty that you can see. Brewhouse Yard is a especially good place to see them. In the huge Castle Rock, you can just stand down the road there and see them above you. You can still find good examples of caves under the old Angel Inn. And you can also still visit and see the only 13th century underground tannery, which was uncovered underneath the Broadmarsh Centre in a cave in the 1970s, and that's still open to visit.
And you've got those amazing historical associations with the castle that we discussed in part one. Now, if you're visiting Nottingham, it's unmissable in the centre of the city, and we've mentioned it a few times. It's the enormous market square. It's a fantastic square, relatively recently redeveloped.
And Market Square is the centrepiece of Nottingham. It's a vast area of over 5 acres in front of the City Hall. George Bradshaw in 1863 called it one of the finest in England, and I think it's pretty comparable in size with Norwich's medieval marketplace. But unlike Norwich's Market Square, the market is gone, being moved out in 1928, and the old cobbles and stetten that were there have been replaced by really a kind of a great flat slab of a space. Now, this was originally the second of 2 marketplaces in Nottingham, set up by the French borough, while the English borough had its own market around Weekday Cross and today's Lace Market. And it's where some legends have Robin Hood competing in the famous archery competition. And it had the unusual feature of that a wall built across the middle of the square until the 1710s. As we mentioned earlier, it's thought this was built to separate the English and French inhabitants. Probably more likely it was just to separate different parts of the market.
It's quite an impressive square, impressive buildings all around the square, really, and some good views of buildings. The most prominent building on the square is the council house, and you can see it for miles around.
Yes, one of Nottingham's most prominent buildings, definitely. It's at the head of the market square. It's built from Portland stone, taken from the same quarry as St Paul's Cathedral, and also used in University of Nottingham's Portland building. It's certainly very grand for a provincial city council building. It has a large dome with an internal mural underneath showing important moments in Nottingham's history, from Danish takeover to Robin Hood and Charles I starting the Civil War. Our old friend Nicholas Pevsner, he didn't like it. Not much can be said in defence. Wren has much to answer for. I do take his criticisms with a pinch of salt, though. He tended to talk down anything that wasn't one of his beloved churches. So let's not take
It's
that
hard
too
to
seriously.
please, isn't he, Pevsner?
Unless it's a church, yes.
Yes, he's hard to. Okay, so industrial city. We always like to talk, when we talk about industry, we always like to talk about railways. You mentioned the Victoria Centre already, which was an old railway terminal. Not much of it left. What else can we talk about in terms of railways in Nottingham?
Yeah, there's a really interesting legacy of the railways in Nottingham. As we said, Nottingham is a Victorian industrial city. Its development is therefore linked closely with the introduction of railways and the construction of numerous lines and stations across the city. And that means you have a really rich railway heritage in the city. Nottingham, being in the middle of the country, had loads of different private operators running trains into various stations in the era before nationalisation. You had the Great Central, the London and North Western, the Great Northern, and the Midland Railway, so that Nottingham at one point had 8 different routes running into London. And there was intense competition between these private operators. In one instance in 1852, a Great Northern engine entered the Midland station and was attacked by the Midland workers, who ripped up the rails to prevent it escaping. The Great Central Railway is one that many people focus on. The line went right up through the centre of the city in a tunnel, from Broadmarsh up Thurland Street, through the Victoria Centre, and up out via Huntingdon Street. You'd never believe a mainline railway ran under there if you stand on Thurland Street today, but there are still some remaining tunnels from that railway today. There are also previously many more smaller stations on the outskirts on the Nottingham Suburban Railway, while many stations have since been demolished, including Lenton, Carrington Street and Sherwood. The station houses at St Answell and Thornywood are still there. And finally, there were loads of industrial freight railways around Nottingham, particularly southeast of the Lace Market between that area and the River Trent. Now, these are all gone now and replaced by modern commercial developments, but easily traceable on old maps if you want to see where they were.
Yeah, and I think you do need to get the old maps to sort of orientate yourself and see where these railways were. But once you've done that, you can start to trace them out, and then you can start to pick up on the features that you can see. What can you still see today?
Well, that's one of the things that's so interesting about this topic, because there is stuff you can still see from the railway heritage. You have the remains not only of the tunnels into Victoria Station, but actually some remains of this major station itself. The clock tower and the station hotel were incorporated into the shopping centre and flats built from 1967 to 1972. You also have a Nottingham London Road station. Now, the low-level station is now a gym. The high-level station was demolished in 2006, unfortunately, but the low-level station is probably the greatest survivor. It was built in 1857, taking trains from the London North Western Railway and the Great Northern Railway. Passenger trains stopped in 1944, but the building is still there. You can still see it from the outside, or go in if you have a gym membership.
So lots of transport, and the Nottingham Beeston Canal was really important in the history of the city as well. And actually, that's now a pretty nice place to visit if you want to get that sense of what an industrial city's early canal system would have looked like. Nicely restored, right in the city centre. But a lot of railways. It's strange though. Today, though, the railways are quite limited in the city. It's quite disappointing how the remains of the railway. The station is not particularly large compared to a lot of cities of this size, although modern trams have been reintroduced and the trams wind their way right through the city centre. So they're quite a nice way of getting around the city.
It does feel like a tricky place to get to by train. I don't know if that's just my perspective from where I live, but it seems to be off the cross-country line, off the East Coast main line, the West Coast main line. Places like even nearby Derby seem much more accessible in many ways.
Well, it's not on one of the north-south main lines. So Derby it's on the Midland main line, and the East Coast main line is going through far smaller places like Grantham and Newark. You know, so Nottingham, you have to kind of leave the branches to leave those big main lines to get into. So it is a bit off, but it did, of course, have that main line of its own that you've described running into what's now the Victoria Shopping Centre. Now, we've spoken a lot about industry, and we've spoken a lot about the old slums of Nottingham and how crowded it was. It's really odd, though, because if you know Nottingham and if you visit today, just west of the castle, if you walk down the hill past the castle, you come to an area of housing that's sort of one of the most luxurious inner city housing areas in the country, really. It's known as the Park Estate. So tell us a bit about the Park Estate.
Yes, Nottingham, you're right. It's not all municipal grandeur and industry. The park is a prominent area of wealthy housing next to the castle, running really between the city centre in that spot and Lenton. The park was developed as the current residential estate that it is now in the 19th century, but it has a much deeper history. It was originally a deer park next to the castle and was used as a royal hunting ground, later providing resources during the Civil War.
A very smart part of the town, and curiously, there is a tunnel leading from the park to Derby Road, which is another way of getting to the Park Estate, which is exciting if you like to explore the caves and tunnels of Nottingham. Now, one architectural type that we've not discussed much so far in this episode, and we usually do when we visit an old English city, we talk about cathedrals and churches. Can you tell us about the Nottingham Cathedral and some of its more prominent churches?
Certainly, yeah. We should definitely talk about the Catholic Cathedral. While it's not a particularly old building in church terms, to be honest, not especially notable in architectural terms, it does represent an important era in the history of Catholicism in England. It was built in 1844 and was at that point the largest post-Reformation Catholic church built in England. The church was made a cathedral just 8 years later in 1852, one of the first cathedrals made in England since the Reformation, as the Catholic dioceses were recreated in 1850, one of which was the Diocese of Nottingham. The decision to kind of reintroduce Catholic dioceses was really followed an increase in the number of Catholics in England, partly caused by Irish migration and partly by greater religious freedoms and tolerance granted in the past century. The context of that really is that Catholic worship itself had been banned in 1791. And most legal restrictions on Catholics weren't lifted until as late as 1829. And I think even today, the monarch is legally barred from becoming or even marrying a Catholic. I think that's just about the last anti-Catholic law that remains today. And to talk about other churches, St Mary's Church, it may be a more interesting building. Now, that's one of the most ancient sites in Nottingham. The first church was built on that site in Saxon times. It's been rebuilt a few times, and the current main building has elements dating from the 14th century. So that's, if you're looking for an ancient church, that's probably the best one to go to. We'll also talk about High Pavement Chapel. Now, many of us will have been in High Pavement Chapel, might not know it by that name. It was built in 1876, made a lace market in 1982, but is most notable since its conversion into a pub. It's retained its stained glass windows, its Gothic arches, all surrounding a bar down the centre of the church. Definitely a unique place to have a drink, and more than one visitor to Nottingham has asked me about it.
Oh, it's a cool place to have a drink. Absolutely beautiful. Stained glass windows. I think it had a spell as the Lace Market Museum as well, but I don't think that worked out. But some part of the Lace Market Museum exhibits moved to another prominent building in Nottingham, which is in the suburbs, well out by the university. And I suppose we're in the urban landscape section. We've discussed the university before, but the university park far in the western suburbs is in itself quite an interesting architectural place to visit. You mentioned the Portland building, the Trent building and its clock tower are quite interesting. But near there, if you have time to get to this part of Nottingham, the tram goes there now. There's a huge park known as Wollaton Park, and in the centre there's a hall.
Yes, we talked about Wollaton Colliery in the Science and Industry episode, but there's definitely a beautiful architectural feature there, Wollaton Hall. It's an Elizabethan mansion near the university, as you said, about an hour's walk west of the city centre if you want to do it on foot. It was built in 1580, and Pevsner's Guide describes it as one of the most important Elizabethan houses in England. Now, it was paid for through those profits of that coal mining on the Wollaton estate that we covered previously by Sir Francis Willoughby. He was a cousin of the 9-day Queen Lady Jane Grey and a great-great-grandson of Edward IV's consort, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. The hall is notable for its spectacular external medieval architectural style, which Pevsner suggests may have been chosen as his nod to Willoughby's royal heritage, his descent and relations to those queens, and also notable for its very symmetrical layout. As well as the building itself, it also houses some good exhibits. It houses Nottingham Natural History Museum and the Nottingham Industrial Museum in the external buildings. The latter is especially important to Nottingham's history because it holds many of the important early lace and textile manufacturing machines that we've been talking about, which were so important to Nottingham's commercial development and expansion. It also has exhibits from many of the important local businesses that we've mentioned, Raleigh, Boots and John Player, as well as local railway memorabilia. So it is a really important place, not just for its own architectural beauty, but also in commemorating so much of the modern history of Nottingham.
Yeah, I think that's right. So if you have time on a visit to Nottingham, I think if you've explored the city centre, it is worth getting out to the Wollaton Hall and the university, which, as we say, are next to each other. There's plenty to see. And if you're into this sort of thing, you can have a peek at the Boots factory as well, which is near the university. There's a footbridge. You can look at some of the mid-20th century industrial architecture there as well. So get out of the city centre, there's more to see. And similarly with the Trent Bridge area, that's a bit close to the city centre, maybe a 15-minute walk south, and a pleasant urban environment with those famous sporting grounds. I suppose this brings us to the end of the urban landscape section. I'll conclude on this because I think Nottingham, I personally find it very interesting, but that's because I'm the sort of person that's going to be looking for these stories of how things came to be. So a place can be quite ugly and I will still find it interesting and find its stories of expansion interesting. And I suppose that's the drawback of Nottingham. It certainly has some good sections of its city centre that have got some interesting buildings, nice layouts, well looked after, but it's also got some pretty disastrous 20th century interventions. You mentioned Maid Marian Way in the culture section. There's quite a lot of poor, in my view, 20th century interventions, which undermine the city a bit, and particularly the fringe of the city centre. So not on the west side, because that's the Park Estate, but to the south and to the east, the city centre fringe, it seems a bit devoid of activity in places and run down. So that's why, for me, it's an interesting urban landscape, but it's got some holes in it. So I'm going to be giving it 6.5.
Okay, well, 6.5 is still a positive score. I think to go on the negatives, for a city of its size, Nottingham doesn't have that many must-see architectural sites or many single features that are particularly unique, with the notable exception of the caves. And I think what you've said about the modern grottiness, the poor architectural and the planning choices is right. Is Nottingham that much worse than other cities of its size? It's hard to say. I subjectively find some of these bits probably less offensive. I don't know if that's just because I've lived there and they're part of my consciousness there. Perhaps it's the topographical changes you see around Nottingham that break some of these things up. You don't just have a dull, flat landscape with a dull, flat road. Even Maid Marian Way is sloped, which somehow makes it more interesting, less offensive to me, perhaps. And I think overall what Nottingham has is perhaps really this mix of different styles. There is some Baroque grandeur, there's renewed, functional Victorian industry, medieval caves and taverns, a smattering of Georgian houses, a grand Elizabethan mansion, and the university campuses, the mix, traditional rolling parkland, as you've said, at University Park, with the really avant-garde Jubilee campus, or at least avant-garde as it was when it was built when we lived there. So what I see in Nottingham is a city that to me it's more than just individual elements. It's more than the sum of its parts. It's somewhere you can spend a long time exploring. You could spend days getting the best out of it, not just in the centre, but on the edges as well. It's the city's landscape, layout and architecture do tell a real story and reflect the development of the city. So I'm going to give it a 7.
No, that's good. And I agree with you. And I think it's key that you explore slightly beyond the city centre. So both universities. We haven't discussed the buildings of Trent University. Trent's got a couple of really interesting buildings, Arkwright Building, and then going north, there's some really nice recreational spaces with some interesting buildings around. So there's definitely stuff to see there. And I take your point. Most British cities, particularly the industrial ones, have had big car-centric planning decisions. But I think what you're seeing in Nottingham, as you're seeing in all the post-industrial British cities, is a gradual reversal of some of those poor planning decisions. So we talked about the Broad Marsh opening up those spaces. And what I love about that is it will open up great views of the castle. It brings that history back into the city so people can see it more prominently. So that leads us on to reality versus expectations. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first. I'll keep it brief. I like to keep this succinct. I think what I love about Nottingham is it's multiple things at once. There are so many facets to its history and so many ways to explore its history. It's the archetypal industrial city with a fascinating medieval past, all of which is celebrated. It has museums covering everything. It has Wollaton Hall covering the industrial history. It has the castle covering its cultural history. Okay, it's not the old medieval castle, but there's still a fascinating cultural heritage that you have. It has literary heritage. There's so many ways to explore it. You can read books, you can read literature, you can watch the Robin Hood films. Everyone in the world knows Nottingham, so the expectations are high. But I think for me, it still exceeded them. It was a great place to live, and it's still a great place to visit and a great place to explore and live history. So for me, it's definitely a positive score. It's a 6.5.
No, I agree. It's an exciting city. I still think
definitely.
that. I think there's a lot going on. It's got a buzz. It's always busy. There's a good mix of people in the city. And one thing that I think it benefits from is it has a lot of these historical interests, but it's not overbearing. It's not a tourist town. It's not Bath, Cambridge, York, Brighton. It's not got that really heavy feel of everyone being a tourist. It's got a little bit of that. It's got visitors. I think it might be the 12th, 13th most visited city in the country. It's got a bit of that, but it's not overbearing. And as you say, there is plenty to see. But what I've really enjoyed about this episode actually is learning about stuff that I hadn't appreciated when I lived in Nottingham. The literature elements, the key history of the castle. It really brought the buildings, the urban landscape to life for me. But so I've got to temper that. And I've said this with many of our big industrial cities, I just think the urban landscape hasn't been respected, and there's a long way to go to get it back. So for me, it's a 6.
Well, Nottingham is a world famous city. For it to get anything positive in reality versus expectations is a really good performance. So that means Nottingham overall got 16 out of 20 for politics and war, 14.5 out of 20 for science and industry, 14.5 for art and culture, 13.5 for urban landscape, 12.5 for reality versus expectations. That is a total of 71, which I think puts it third in the league table. I think Liverpool's still top with 79. Cambridge, I think, still second with 74. But it goes above Shrewsbury, I think, to 69, which has 69.5.
That's all we have time for on Nottingham. There were so many other things we could have covered, actually, and it was absolutely jam-packed episode, and I'm sure we'll get someone pointing out all the things we've missed. Certainly a great city, lots going on, great place to visit for history, for music, for sport, you name it. It's a great place to hang out. Our next episode will be another one of our thematic episodes, moving forward in time. Can you tell us a bit about what you've got in store for the next episode?
Yes, so we have our kind of chronological mini side series where we talk about the overall development of English towns and cities. We've already done the origins of English towns and cities. We did the Middle Ages. Next, we're going to talk about a really exciting time. It encompasses war, the early stages of industry. We're going to talk about Tudor, Stuart and Georgian cities. We're not quite sure how we'll split it up. We might need to do a couple of episodes, perhaps thematically split or chronologically split, but that's what I'm researching at the moment. So they'll be coming up soon.
Absolutely fantastic. And you can hear all our episodes at yeoldeguide.com, where you can leave a comment on any episode. You can also find all our episodes at all good podcast directories, and if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave a rating and review. We love those. And that's all for now. So I have been Liam Groth, and it's been great to be joined by Daniel Gooch. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.